Talk now about last week. We're going to talk about, this terror attack. Last week, the two lone wolf terror attacks in Canada and the one on the streets of New York with the hatchet. All three targeted military and law enforcement officials, and the mere definition of a lone wolf attacker is that they are working alone, that they don't have to tell anyone what they are planning or what they're doing, what their motivation was behind it. How can the Homeland Security forces brace for these types of attacks?
Well, first of all, I think that we need to recognize that radical Islamism is in many ways a virus much like Ebola. It doesn't spread from Syria to Iraq to Libya. It spreads on the internet. The man in Oklahoma City recently who cut off the woman's head, the Army major who got up and yelled Allahu Akbar and began shooting people at Fort Hood, the cases you just described. The lone wolf is only accurate in the sense that they are self-initiated and uncoordinated, and I think we're going to have more of them. What bothered me about the president's reaction was he said, gee, we don't know what their motivation is.
Let's play it and then we can talk about it. Here's what the president said last week.
We don't yet have all the information about what motivated the shooting. We don't yet have all the information about whether this was part of a broader network or plan, or whether this was an individual or a series of individuals who decided to take these actions. But it emphasizes the degree to which we have to remain vigilant when it comes to dealing with these kinds of acts of senseless violence or terrorism.
Okay, so this was your response on Twitter. You said, President Obama's statement on Canadian killings verges on delusional. He can't bring himself to tell the truth about radical Islamists.
Sure. Well, look, remember, this is an administration which defined the Fort Hood attack as a workplace incident, which it clearly wasn't. The major who got up carrying a card in his wallet that said he was a soldier, a warrior of Islam, having been constantly in touch with a radical cleric, yelling Allahu Akbar and shooting people, that's not a workplace incident. That's
what do you want to hear
terrorism.
from the president about radical Islam?
I want the president to say that we are up against a worldwide movement, that we've had two people from Minnesota, for example, killed in Syria, one of whom had clearance for 10 years to work on the Minneapolis airport. We're lucky he decided to take his terrorism out in Syria and not at the airport. That we are faced with a movement which spreads on the internet, it spreads in our communities. We're probably going to have to adopt some pretty tough new laws about certain kinds of behavior. Recruiting for ISIS ought to be illegal and people ought to go to jail. Any kind of funding ought to be closed down. And this is going to really infringe on a number of so-called charities that have somehow magically end up giving their money to terrorist groups. So I think we underestimate how pervasive and how real a problem this is.
You realize that by having this conversation, right, it may be deemed as Islamophobic or anti-Islam or anti-Muslim or bigoted in some way. Do you understand that?
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly stupid. These are people, when you go to their websites, I always describe it as radical Islamist. I'm not describing all Muslims. I'm not describing people who are appalled by this. But I would suggest to you that there is a very deep tradition of very anti-Western behavior, that cutting off people's heads is nothing new.
And so you think that just by having the conversation, it should not be deemed as bigoted in any way because it's a legitimate conversation.
Why is the accurate description of the behavior of people who are murderers and who are torturers and who are currently raping women, selling them into slavery, why is the accurate description of their behaviors somehow immediately impugned as though it's the motive? These are not Norwegian Lutherans. These are not Indian Buddhists. These are people who have a particular background. They advocate the establishment of a caliphate. They're very honest about who they are.
Okay.
It's only Western elites who are afraid.
Is ISIS directing lone wolves in the West? And what will it take to stop the next one? Joining me now is Arsalan Iftikhar. He's a senior editor of the Islamic Monthly magazine. Thank you for coming on and talking about this, Arsalan. I don't know if you heard my conversation with Newt Gingrich, but a little bit earlier in the show he said that radical Islam is a virus spreading like Ebola. What's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, Newt Gingrich, once said that President Obama was a Kenyan with an anti-colonialist worldview and, supported Michelle Bachmann's McCarthyist witch hunt against Hillary Clinton's aides that happened to be Muslim. And so, anything that Newt Gingrich says, I take with a container of salt. I think what's important to keep in mind is that what we're seeing now with ISIS, and especially in terms of their recruitment of lone wolves who are tending to self-radicalize. We're seeing a shift in sort of the terrorist recruitment methodology over the last 10 years, whereas Al-Qaeda traditionally, people would go to terrorist training camps and, have a graduation ceremony with a, fake certificate. But now essentially, now you have young teenagers who are disenfranchised, who are sitting, in their mom's basements, on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and essentially self-radicalizing without any sort of contact with a centralized terrorist organization. So I think it's a little bit different of a paradigm when you're looking at ISIS compared to what we saw with Al-Qaeda historically.
We're talking about Newt Gingrich. He did say radical Islam, and in that same statement he says he's not demonizing all Muslims. So it's, he's not just talking about, you don't think that radical Islamists are an issue right now, that it's spreading faster than before?
Well, I think extremism of any sort is troublesome in any free society. I mean, CNN's terrorism expert Peter Bergen, wrote an op-ed on CNN.com this year saying that right-wing extremists in America have actually caused more damage and killed more Americans than jihadists have. The New America Foundation found that only 26 Americans have been killed by jihadist terrorists in the last 12 years. You have more of a likelihood to die from drowning in your bathtub and getting struck by lightning than you do being killed by a jihadist. So I think it's important that we take care of this issue, but I also think it's important not to overblow it the way that Newt Gingrich did.
Let's talk now about these so-called lone wolves, and especially when you look at what happened in Canada last week and also the hatchet attack here. And they said that they were self-radicalized and they were converts. Do you think ISIS knew the names of someone like Michael Zehaf-Bibo and Zale Thompson before last week?
No. And I was actually on Meet the Press on NBC News yesterday, and I actually said, and I quote, "I would bet all the money in my pocket that ISIS had never heard of Michael Zehaf-Bibo before they did this." And that's actually part of why they've been successful, Don. It's something that a lot of counterterrorism experts have come to term the new jihadi cool, which is essentially a global street gang where you have young, disenfranchised, teenagers and men in their early 20s and 30s who many times have rap sheets a mile long. Michael Zehaf-Bibo was arrested on drug possession and criminal mischief and all things like that. And like a global street gang, they're just putting their message out there and seeing if anybody will take the bait. And in the case of Michael Zehaf-Bibo, he did. I don't think that it had anything to do with ISIS Central in Syria and northern Iraq, but I think that is something, the sort of online aspect of the countering terrorism aspect of it is something that the American government is more focused on these days.
Let's talk about, I had a fascinating conversation with my colleague Fareed Zakaria last week. There was breaking news. It didn't get to air here, but he makes a really good point. He also writes about it, that there have been long periods, centuries of time, where Islam has been peaceful, but that there is what he calls, and this is a quote, a cancer of extremism in Islam today. Do you agree? Is radicalism more inherent to Islam now than it was in the past?
No, not at all, Don. And actually, I was on your show a few weeks ago on the same topic of whether Islam is more inherently violent of a religion than anything else. And I think it's absurd for anyone to say that any religion is more violent than anything else. I think it is we human beings that are fallible. I think that it is Muslims that have problems. I think it's Christians, Jewish people, Hindus, Buddhists. I think it is we humans and our interpretation of religious scripture. I mean, every religion on the face of the earth, any theologian would tell you, teaches us the concept of the golden rule of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, and loving thy God and loving thy neighbor. And so, again, I will push back until the day that I die. I mean, there's.
But Arsalan, you have to say, at this moment in time, when you look at now, when you look at what's happening in the news, and you're looking at radicalism, you're looking at people, you can understand why someone might have that sentiment when you consider what appears to be overwhelming evidence that there's violence going on, whether it's Islam or someone who's misinterpreting the doctrine or what have you. But it is happening. You can't deny that.
And I'm not, Don, but what I am saying is put it in a little bit of context. I quoted you the statistic from the New America Foundation that said that 26 Americans have died in the last 13 years from jihadist terrorism. That's 2 people a year. You, again, have a 5 times more likely chance of getting struck by lightning. What the media doesn't cover is the fact that 5 out of the last 12 Nobel Peace Prize winners were Muslims. You don't look at the 1.7 billion Muslims around the earth that are contributing to society. Like here in America, America with soup kitchens and free health clinics. And so when we talk about media meta-narratives, yeah, I understand. I'm a journalist, so I understand if it bleeds, it leads. And that's, we have to add some nuance to a lot of these meta-narratives that are going on there, because we don't want any demographic group to be to have any sort of collective guilt placed on it by the actions of a few.
Arsalan, thank you very much. I would like to continue the conversation, but I've got to get to a break because we're almost at the end of the show. Thank you. Let's have this conversation again. Please come back on.